Welcome to another episode of the Gay Barchive Show, where we explore gay history one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith, and our guest today is Lauren Taylor with SafeBars.org and DefendYourself.org. Welcome to the show, Lauren.
Thanks for having me.
You're quite welcome. I'm kind of excited to hear about some of your bar history from Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. Why don't we start off with your first bar experience? What was your first gay bar experience like?
It was a place called Club Madame. It was on 8th Street Southeast. Quite a few gay bars have been in that strip over time, near the Marine Barracks, which I don't think was a coincidence. And a friend took me, and it was drag night. And this is many years ago. I was 20 at the time. It was probably early 1978. And I think that I found the whole thing kind of a little shocking and overwhelming, but I tried to play it cool because, I wanted to be cool.
What was the bar itself like? Do you remember anything? Was it a big bar, a small bar?
It was small-ish. It was a storefront, although it might have been upstairs. But it wasn't like one of those big, dance floor kind of bars or multi-level kind of bars. So it was small-ish. And the only thing I remember about it is I have a few sort of photographic memories in my head of the performers. Otherwise, I don't remember much about the bar itself.
And it was a mixed bar, right? There were men and women in there.
It was a men's bar that there were some women there.
Okay. And that was not very uncommon in some of the clubs back then. It seemed like it, especially ones that had shows, tended to attract somewhat of a lesbian audience as well as the gay male audience.
Yeah.
And at that time, I don't know if the experience was the same for you or about the same age, but back in that time, everything was gay. So a lesbian bar was a gay bar, a men's bar was a gay bar, a drag bar was a gay bar. They were all gay. And even the national organizations were for gay rights or liberation, or it was a blanket term, kind of like queer is now, sort of.
Well, and I honestly remember, all of us fighting to get the word lesbian in the name of the National Gay Task Force and things like that.
And it happened.
Yeah, but it wasn't easy. There was a lot of resistance.
There was. Now, there's another couple of bars you mentioned to me that that also were kind of important to you in your early days of clubbing and partying. One of them you mentioned is Grand Jury. Now, was Grand Jury a women's bar?
Grand Jury was a straight bar that was in downtown DC that I think, if I remember correctly, it was in the building with the American Bar Association or something. So it had a very lawyerly clientele, which is why they had that name. And then, if I remember correctly, it was once a week. It was a women's bar. It might have been twice a week, but so it was a women's bar. It was a women's bar, I think, on Saturday night when the lawyers would not have been downtown because it was in an office area of DC.
Right.
So it was a straight bar with a women's night.
And is it safe to assume that because of its connection to the judicial crowd, that it was a little bit more of an upscale type environment inside than you would have seen at Club Banana?
No. It was pretty dumpy. I don't know why. I mean, it's a logical point you're making, but it didn't happen that way. It was pretty dumpy. It had crappy booths and crappy tables, and I would imagine all the lawyers sitting there eating greasy fries and hamburgers. But the main reason I went there is they had a dance floor and a DJ who played good music.
And what was the crowd like? Was it on Saturday nights when you went as a women's bar? Was it younger women, older women, you know, but was there any particular crowd, or was it just kind of women in general?
Well, let me just caveat everything I'm going to say with my memory sucks. I think, I mean, I would have been in my late 20s, mid to late 20s when I was there. And I think that there were definitely women in their early 20s, and there are definitely women into their 30s and 40s. I think there were a lot of, you know, more there were more people who didn't identify as butcher femme in those days. Well, not in those days, but in that scene. I myself was only just coming to the realization of my femme identity. It was primarily white, as many of these bars were. You know, just like everything else, the bar scene is pretty segregated in DC. But it wasn't exclusively white. Yeah, so that's what I remember about who was there. I remember dancing to a lot of Madonna.
They didn't actively segregate in a lot of those bars at that time. I think part of it was a function of where they were located. You know, if there happened to be a lot of white people who lived or worked in that general area, they would be more likely maybe to go there and party than a neighborhood that was more distant and more, you know, ethnic.
Well, I think there's a lot of factors. You know, one, you have to look at, well, why were those neighborhoods segregated to begin with? And there was another bar that I'm now blanking on the name of. So there was a bar area in DC in those days, in a warehouse district, which has now been totally gentrified and has big luxury apartment buildings and upscale office buildings. But it was a warehouse district, and there were quite a few gay bars down there. And there was a women's bar there in those days that only carded the black women, let the white women in without showing our ID. So, you know, so there were some things like that were very overt. And we actually, a whole bunch of us, you know, staged a protest and tried to get them to change their ways. I don't remember what happened. I also don't remember the name of the bar, but so there was some direct overt racism at play as well.
Now, as a lesbian at that time, would you say that the women's bars were cruisy at all? Did you go there in the hopes of maybe not hooking up for the night, but at least meeting a soulmate or meeting somebody that you could connect with romantically?
I more often went to dance with my friends. I would say that was my primary focus in going to bars. But I do remember a couple periods in my life when I was single and looking to meet people where, like, you know, where I would go with a friend and she would introduce me to people I didn't know and that kind of thing. So sometimes I did what you're talking about, but more often it was about getting together with friends every week or every month or however often, and just, you know, dancing in groups and having a great time and getting sweaty and getting our yayas out.
Yeah, I've heard that from a lot of the women I've spoken to. And having been out in the gay bar scene at the same time, I know as a gay male, it was almost exactly the opposite for me. Of course, I did go out to interact with my friends, because at that time, that was the only place you were likely to run into a group of gay people. You weren't going to go to the local TGI Fridays and see a dozen gay men that you knew hanging out there. So we went to the gay bars for socializing purposes as well. But I remember many, many times going out, with the specific goal of meeting somebody, either for a short term or possibly a longer term relationship of some sort.
Well, one thing that's different in my life than your experience, and I think is true of a lot of people, is that I did have other places to be around lesbians because I was an activist. And I was more of a feminist activist than I was an LGBTQ activist, although I did both, and I still am both. But the feminist spaces that I was in were almost entirely queer or almost entirely lesbian. So that was another place where we had community and connection.
Yeah, and the bars back then played such a big role in the development of these activist movements and these different rights movements that we have, now that we kind of take for granted that, equality, HRC, all these groups are out there, and we're like, yeah, big deal. But back then, they basically all had their roots in the bars. I mean, whether it was because the people met there to have meetings, or the groups fundraised there because that was a safe place to go.
Right.
The bars were open to the idea and supportive. So it was a really big part of our life back then to have this network of bars. And there were quite a few. I mean, I'm sure in a city like DC, there must have been dozens of bars if you counted all of them, whether they were geared for men, women, crowds, people of color, whatever. They were scattered all over, unlike the way it is today.
I'm not sure I would say there were dozens. There were dozens over time, over the decades, but at any given moment, there probably were certainly probably no more than 20. I remember The Blade, which is our gay newspaper here, used to, back when print was really a thing, used to list the bars and used to have a like a legend, like on a map, like this is for women, this is for men, this, yeah. So that might be something you could look into and see how many there were at any given moment. But yeah, I mean, I would think between the men and the women, there were probably at the peak, there was probably in the 20s.
Yeah. And I also recently interviewed Gina Gatta. I don't know if you know Gina, but for the last 25 or 30 years, she's been the owner of the Damron Company. And she was involved with the launch of the Damron Guides for Women. And they have a lot of listings as well. So I've spoken to her as well. Now, another bar you mentioned from that general time frame back in DC is one that I am personally familiar with. I've made several trips to DC and back in the day, and it was a disco that was well known around the country because they had a location in Denver, they had a location in DC, they had a location in Tampa, Florida, and I think there were several others, and that was Trax.
Yep.
So the two bars you've talked about so far were more or less kind of neighborhood type bars on the small to medium side.
Yeah.
What was it like when you walked into Trax for the first time?
Honestly, I don't remember the first time. I just remember, and I think it was the first Tuesday of the month was Women's Night, and there was a women's tea dance on Sundays once a month. That's what I remember of the schedule. I could be wrong about that because, as I said, my memory is compromised. But so, and I was pretty regular attendee at both of those things. And again, it was about hanging out with friends and getting to dance.
And it was a much bigger club. The
Yes.
Trax was a huge disco. And I think didn't they have a patio area as well?
Yes, they had outside, which was great, especially for the tea dance because that was during the day. They had, so they had like a patio. There was a sand volleyball.
Yeah, I remember.
Pit or whatever the word is for that. There may have been other outdoor games that I don't remember, but I remember the volleyball. Yeah, so it was lovely to, be able to be outside and hang out.
Now, for me, my first gay bar experience was not too far from DC. I was in college, and the guy that I was dating lived in Baltimore, and I went down there for a weekend, and we went out to dinner, and he said, well, we're going to go around the corner and go to this club I discovered down here called the Hippo. And the Hippo was a lot like Trax. It was a pretty good sized bar, multiple floors, big dance floor. And I know I was just blown away because I thought, and this was back in the late 70s, I was blown away because I thought, wow, not every bar that we have is going to be a little hole in the wall or dumpy place or whatever. This is like this is a big deal. We can go in there and there's not tens of people in there, but there's hundreds or maybe thousands of people in there.
Yep.
So it was kind of an eye-opening experience to know that the community was that large.
Yes.
And I'm sure it was the same way at Trax. You go in there and you're like, oh my God, there's so many people here.
Yeah.
I don't know everybody here. How about that?
Yeah. Yeah. I used to be like, where did all these lesbians come from? And where are they the rest of the month?
So yeah, Trax was a great place, and they're still operating.
Are they?
One in DC, but the original Trax in Denver is still operating.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty amazing, because that's a long run for a gay bar.
Yep, very long run.
Now, I'd asked you before the interview if there was one bar from your past that you could revive and revisit. What would that bar be? And you picked a bar that I've heard of from a few other people in DC before. Apparently, it was a popular and important bar in the women's scene in DC. What was that bar? What was
called the Phase. And it was also like Club Madame. It was on 8th Street Southeast. It was, I probably should have read up on my history before we talked, but it was, I think, the longest open lesbian bar in the country until it closed a few years ago. One of the things about it was that it was a lesbian bar. It wasn't a gay men's bar that had a women's night. It wasn't a straight bar that had a women's night. It was a lesbian bar. And it was also a storefront. It relatively small. It had a dance floor. It had a jukebox. I think sometimes they had a DJ. It had a pool table. It had some great bartenders. It was just a solid, important, central part of the lesbian community.
Now, you would, I assume, go there on a fairly regular basis. Was that kind of like a favorite hangout for you?
I did go there. First of all, I wouldn't say on a regular basis. I went, when I did go to bars, I went more and when they were open, I went more to Grand Jury and Trax because they were better for dancing. They had DJs and they had substantial dance floors, whereas the dance floor at the Phase was pretty tiny. And I think I remember they only had a jukebox, although I could be wrong about that. So I did go to the Phase over time, more than now and again, but I didn't go regularly like I did to the other ones.
Did you tend to find the same kind of crowd at Phase 1 when you went? Did it have a consistent crowd, or was it just different people kind of wandering in and out? Did you notice, because it was, there was time between each visit?
Yeah, I mean, I was not a regular. I think there were a lot of regulars. I think there were a lot of people who went there, several times a week or every weekend. I think it had more of a working class vibe, although I don't know that meant that there were more working class people there. Yeah, and again, it was predominantly white, although there were definitely some Black women and other women of color there. Yeah, that's what I remember about it. But it historically, it just has such an important place in both in DC lesbian history and in women's bar history. That's why I said I would resurrect it if I could.
And there is a project out there called the Lesbian Bar Project.
Yes.
That has been doing an excellent job of reporting on the status of lesbian bars around the country.
Yep.
And I think we've dwindled down to like 13 or 14, something like that now in the entire US. There are not a huge abundance of them. But I heard through a mutual acquaintance of ours, Ebony Bell, he had mentioned that there's a new bar called As You Are that is opening up, which, although not exclusively a lesbian bar, is lesbian owned. Yes. And will be catering to the women's crowd as well as, other people who are, whether they're gay or any of the letters of LGBTQ. Which is, I guess, in some way refreshing. You may not be getting phased back, but you're getting a safe place to hang out back in the area.
Right. Yeah. So I was going to make sure that you knew about them. I don't know if you've interviewed Joe and Rach, who are the people behind As You Are Bar. But they have a wonderful vision that goes beyond a traditional bar into more of a community hangout space that's, allows people to not just be alcohol focused, but has lots of activities and lots of different kinds of support. And near and dear to my heart, they're very, because I've been an activist on ending gender-based violence my whole adult life, they have a very consent-based culture that they put out there very strongly. So they've been pretty much for the whole pandemic, they've been holding virtual events, and they're close to opening their brick and mortar.
And I'm looking forward to that. I have reached out to them, to both Rach and Joe. We have not yet scheduled a session, but I am looking forward to it because I definitely want to, feature their story and the bar, even though it's not yet a part of gay history. I realized a while back in the beginning, I was only talking about bars that were long gone. And it occurred to me, I kept saying to myself while I was doing my research, I wish somebody had recorded information about these bars while they were open. And then after, I know, I was apparently a little bit slow. It took me about 6 months, and it slapped me across the head. And I said, wait a minute, why am I it and I'm not doing it? So I have spoken to several people who own or operate bars that are still in existence. Some of them that have been there for decades, and one in New York City that opened 6 months ago, which is going to make a big impact on the market there. Now that bar, which is called the Q, also has that philosophy of being not a men's bar or not a women's bar, but a queer bar. That's what the Q stands for.
Right.
And they intend to have entertainment and spaces and events that are geared toward every aspect of the culture. And one of their investors there is Billy Porter. And if that's if that's not one of the poster children for non-binary presentation, I don't know who would be. So I'm excited about As You Are as well.
That's great that he's on board.
Yeah, it's a really cool concept. So you spent all your time living in DC, and as would possibly be expected, depending on your familiarity with DC, you've been involved in the political realm on some level for pretty much all of your adult life as an activist for both women's rights and gay rights, LGBT rights, whatever we call them. And I understand right now you're very actively involved with two programs. One of them is called SafeBars, and the website is SafeBars.org. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what SafeBars is about, and what your focus is and what you do for the community in general?
So, SafeBars focuses on creating safe and respectful hospitality spaces for everyone, whether it's for the guests or for the people who work there. Um, there, although alcohol does not cause sexual assault, there is a relationship between sexual assault and alcohol that's actually very complex. I can oversimplify it by saying that alcohol is used as a weapon to incapacitate someone who's being targeted, and as an excuse by people who commit harassment and worse, kind of like, I didn't know what I was doing, I was drunk, kind of thing. And people who work in restaurants have the highest amount of workplace sexual harassment of any industry in the country. So SafeBars empowers people who work in hospitality with skills to prevent and interrupt harassment, no matter who is doing the harassing and who is being targeted. So it doesn't matter whether it's patron on patron harassment, a patron harassing a staff member or manager harassing another staff member, or a staff member harassing a patron. What matters is that you, as a witness, are in a position to step up and do something. So we do this work. We have 3 different approaches to this work. So one is an active bystander approach, where, as I just said, you as a witness are in a position to step up and do something, whether it's a low-key thing like, hey, how's it going over here? Or whether it's, more direct, like, hey, it doesn't look like they're into it. Can you back off a little bit? So that's the active bystander approach. We also teach empowerment and self-defense, and those are the skills that you need if you are the person being targeted. You don't want to necessarily wait around for a good bystander to come by and help you out, but you want to be able to stand up on behalf of your own self, and that's what we teach: assertiveness, boundary setting, and worst case scenario, physical strikes for if you have to defend yourself physically. And then the third thing that we do is really grew out of the pandemic, which is that we teach de-escalation skills for dealing with problematic behavior from patrons. Probably everybody knows, even if you just follow social media or read the news, that with the pandemic, the public is treating all public-facing workers, whether you work in a grocery store or a hospital or hospitality, the public there's some very bad behavior from members of the public, and some of it is just verbal aggression, and I don't want to say just because it can be very horrible, but some of it is actually physical aggression and physical attacks and things like spitting on people. So we teach people who work in hospitality de-escalation skills that help them keep themselves and others safe.
So your target audience for the website and the program is predominantly geared at people who are in the hospitality industry. So yes. Bar owners, bartenders, waiters, any of those people. You could go and visit SafeBars.org and learn more about your program, reach out to you for any interaction or any additional information. And this is not just on a regional level. You're not just focused on Washington, D.C.
Not at all.
With venues across the country.
We have, and even a little bit outside of the country. I don't know if many of your followers have tuned into what's going on in craft beer, but this year there has been a Me Too reckoning in craft beer when some very oppressive behavior from that was happening in craft beer, whether it be by owners and brewers or whether it be by you know, people related to the industry, like distributors. So we've really focused this year on meeting the demand from breweries, craft breweries. So we've trained, I don't know the number, maybe 40 craft breweries, focusing not only on their tap rooms, but also their production, their sales teams, every aspect of the industry. And those breweries have been all over the United States, and a couple of them have even been out of the country.
Great. You should probably connect with a guy that I did an interview with. He interviewed me for his one of his columns. His name is Dave Infante, and he does a newsletter blast called Fingers, which is drinking culture, being online and beyond. And he also writes for a couple of wine publications. So I'll make sure that he gets your information and sees this segment, and maybe you can connect somehow on that level.
Yeah, I would love to.
He's very much active on Twitter, especially posting about the craft beer culture, wine bars, things of that nature. So definitely be a good contact there. Now, you have another organization that you're also working with that is in some ways kind of interrelated with the SafeBars concept. You have one called DefendYourself.org. And what does DefendYourself.org do?
Defend Yourself teaches people who are targeted for gender-based violence, which is primarily women, LGBTQ, and non-binary people, skills for stopping harassment, abuse, and assault. So we teach prevention and awareness. We teach verbal skills, which is what you need most of the time for your everyday life, things like assertiveness and boundary setting. And then we teach physical skills, for the worst case scenario, if someone physically attacks you, what's the easiest and most effective ways to hit back and get yourself to safety. Defend Yourself has been around for close to 25 years. We've trained probably close to 40,000 people of all ages. And people find it very empowering and transformative to have the skills to be empowered and kind of take up space in their own lives and be able to protect themselves.
And you do this training mostly in person or online? How do you
So it was in person until the pandemic, and now we do it mostly online.
Which is a good thing because it broadens your market area quite a bit. I mean, you can train somebody in San Francisco between, their work break and going out for the night or whatever.
Yep. And in fact, since so much has moved online, and SafeBars trainings have also mostly moved online, Defend Yourself has trained people everywhere, including the most distant places that we've trained have been people in Kazakhstan and Sri Lanka.
Oh, wow.
So yes, we can train people anywhere.
It's truly an international effort.
Yeah.
Very cool. So when you're dealing with your activist side and your training side, your more professional side, do you find that you interact more with any particular group? Do you find that your clientele or the people who are interested in your programs tend to be more, male, female, transgender? Is there any specific group that we hear a lot about transgender violence right now, and is that reflected in the people that are contacting you? Are there a lot of non-binary, transgender?
So I have to give two separate answers for Defend Yourself and SafeBars. So in SafeBars, we're training who we're usually contacted by an owner or a manager, and we're training whoever their employees are. And regardless of who their employees are, we make sure to talk about, highlight, educate people on, et cetera, all the kinds of violence that they might experience, that might be targeting them, or that they might witness as staff. So we do talk a lot about violence against primarily women, transgender men, and non-binary people, because it can be something that folks kind of is not in their awareness, or if it is in their awareness, it's kind of not real to them. So we want to take it everything from, well, why do transgender people have some of the highest murder rates in the country, to what does it mean if someone's refusing to use your correct pronouns in your workplace? So we make sure that even if that's not an issue that they bring up, that we bring it up, and we consider it. I consider it like aligned with our values, and I consider it a responsibility. Like, no matter where we are, no matter what the culture is where we are, we always talk about, we introduce the practice of introducing yourself with your pronouns. We talk about why we do that. So we're kind of raising people's consciousness in that way. Not that everybody doesn't already know about it. Some people do already know about it, but a lot of people don't. But it's an important part of what we're trying to do, because it does affect, the kinds of violence that people experience, whether it's microaggressions or the worst case scenario. In Defend Yourself, I would say, and I don't have statistics on this, but I would say that our largest demographic of let me back up for a minute. Defend Yourself runs two kinds of trainings, right? So one of them is, you have an organization and you want us to train your folks. So it could be a bowling club, it could be a workplace, it could be a book club, it could be a Girl Scout troop, it could be a faith group. No matter what your group is, we will come to you. Sometimes that's virtually, but we will come to you and do a customized workshop for your group. We have done quite a bit of training for transgender and non-binary people that way, because we've worked with some organizations who that is their constituency or their clientele. For example, we've worked with the DC Department of Health Trans Wellness Program. But then the other kind of trainings that Defend Yourself does is, we open classes up to the public, and basically anybody can sign up for them. In that category, I would say most of what we get are young cis women, and probably quite right along with that is teens. So the teens are usually brought to our programs by their parents, who are worried about them and want them to be prepared, which is a good thing, because young people, women in particular, teen girls, are in the highest risk period for sexual assault, for abuse in relationships, for stalking, for everything. The highest risk age is roughly 14 to 24. But then we have the folks who are old enough to come to us on their own, and those also tend to be young women, especially back in the days when we were training in person until the beginning of 2020. And most of our programs were focused on DC. Living in a big city with a lot of street harassment, I think, is a constant reminder of your vulnerability. And a lot of people would come to us because they just didn't know how to handle street harassment and were tired of being scared or angry or both all the time.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate the work you're doing in both those fields with SafeBars and Defend Yourself, which are both important aspects of kind of help keeping us in general, the entire community, safe and secure. And I really appreciate your insight into some of the club scene in DC. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today and tell us a little bit about your partying background as well as your background.
Thank you. It was great to have a little bit of a walk down memory lane. I appreciate it.
That concludes another episode of the Gabe Archive Show.